Everybody, we're just getting ready to get started back up in a couple minutes. I see Kevin's in there. Are you out there, Kevin?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. Thanks for coming. Yeah. I was
Thanks
looking forward to getting to meet you in person this year, but I guess that's going to have to wait for one day.
God, nobody wants to meet me in person.
I think I used to see you back in the day, like in the hallways at Sands, going between classrooms.
Man, that has been a while.
Yeah, back in the day, as they say.
I was just having a conversation with somebody the other day and realized that it's been 6 years since I taught for Sands.
Has it? Yeah, a lot can happen in 6 years.
Yes, well, hell, a lot has happened this month.
Yeah. How's Secure Ideas been?
Knock on wood, pray our butts off. We've been doing pretty well. We're 23 people now.
Awesome.
And our goal is to end the pandemic with as many people as we started, if not more.
Yeah.
And so far we are. Jason, Denise, and I, the three owners of the company, just been trying to focus on making sure everybody's okay. That's one of the problems with the distributed company is it's nice to say, okay, everybody's working from home and everybody's working from their place, but at the same time, there's way less visibility into how people are doing. And I don't mean how well they're working,
right?
But how are you functioning? How are you? And so Jason is really been driving effort at trying to figure out, making sure that's good. You know what I mean? So.
That's good to hear. Yeah, that's really neat.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I don't mean to yawn.
It's contagious.
It is. Jason and I did a 3-day class over, the last 3 days. And I would say that on a regular basis, one of us was causing the other one to yawn.
I can imagine. Yeah, what was the class on that you guys did?
It was application security. It was just our 3-day P's class.
Yeah, very cool.
We had a good turnout, 77 students.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I'll say that the Jason and Mick have been doing a lot of work on Samurai at getting. We have the 5.0 release we're working on.
Yeah,
and trying to get it so that it runs in Amazon workspaces.
Yeah,
and it made running the class very interesting. Virtual classes are always odd, right?
Sure.
But yeah, it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. Sounds like it might be good timing to get all the kinks ironed out and then come back for BSides 2021 to talk about.
I'm cool with that. Yeah, I was actually really looking forward to. I've never been to Greenville before.
All right. Are you guys are up in Charlotte, right? Or
so I'm a horrible person, and you all will laugh at me for this, but I always say that we're based in Charlotte, South Carolina. And I'm aware that that isn't a real thing. So we're based out of Rock Hill. And
okay, same difference.
So we've got, yeah, exactly, right. But so we've got people in Charlotte, we've got people south of Charlotte, and they've been up to. I mean, they've been in Greenville a number of times. I've just never made it. And yes, Jason just corrected me. The way I said it implied that it's not yet working in workspaces. It works great in workspaces.
Oh, okay.
What I'm talking about is there's more stuff we want to do with it. It's not yet a full release. So this is the problem with having Jason in the Discord channel, is he can correct.
Right. Keep you honest. We always need somebody to keep us honest. So, yeah. Well, awesome. Well, thanks again for coming and talking. We appreciate, I reached out to Jeannie, and I really appreciate for her jumping in, and you come in along and bringing Jason and Oshan along for the ride. So I know saw a lot of terrific feedback from Jason's talk. So I was really excited. Definitely, yeah, I bet I definitely want to go back and watch the recording once we get that edited and out there. So,
Yep.
but yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming and doing this and sharing with the group. So I will get out of the way. I'm gonna make you the.
So I'm assuming I should share my screen, and
you should have access now to share.
Cool, thank you.
All right, thanks, Kevin.
Okay, so I'm hoping that you guys can see the right screen. This is the problem with PowerPoint, is it throws itself when you're sharing out to a screen like this. And I can't see the Discord server. So if you're talking to me there, I can't see it. But
it looks good. Removing the cobwebs.
Yep, good, perfect. So we're going to talk about removing the cobwebs, and this is actually Jason and Mick and Eric and Nathan, all the consultants and security devs, and I have been discussing this quite a bit. There is the historic traditional web pen testing, and what we've realized is that most of our testing nowadays really focuses, especially when we're talking about new applications, mobile applications, embedded applications, cloud-based applications, that there are some things about these applications that you need to start focusing on, and many pen testers aren't. And let's forget pen testers for a second. Many developers and QA people are not considering these parts. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. Little quickly, I'm Kevin. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself. I'm a nerd. I've been a nerd for a very long time. I am one of the founders of Secure Ideas. We are a consulting firm based in Jacksonville, Florida, but we're spread out. We have staff up in just south of Charlotte, Oklahoma, Texas. And we're 10 years old this year, which is mind-boggling to me that we've been around this long. I'm also an IANS faculty member, a course author, instructor. Matter of fact, Jason Gillum and I just wrapped up our 3-day PEAS course, our application security course, this week, and we're in the middle of one of our CISSP mentorship runs. I'm also an open source fanatic. I love building and managing and maintaining open source software. It's one of those things that I recommend to everybody not to do. It always sounds like a great idea, like, hey, I'm going to build this thing and I'm going to publish it and the world will love me. That's not true. The world doesn't love you, and the world doesn't love me, and it's a lot of work, but it's very, very worth it. The reason I don't recommend doing it is because it's a lot of work, and so many people stand up open source projects and then they die. So think about it if you're going to do it. My recommendation is start by contributing to another project. I will tell you that Samurai WTF, the web training framework, is currently in its 5.0 development branch. And we are absolutely looking for contributors. We would love more people to help us build it. And then another thing, I'm a member of the 501st. I am a Star Wars nerd. I was actually planning on being at my office today to do this, and I have a Sand Trooper costume behind me, but I'm at home, so you don't get to see the Sand Trooper costume. But if you're ever in Jacksonville, swing by the office. We have costumes all over the place. So what is it about traditional pen testing? And I want to be very clear, I'm talking about application pen testing here, right? We see a lot of things, and we see a lot of people doing different things, right? So we have a wide gamut, and it all started, it didn't all start, but the idea of pen testing applications, if you want to think about applications in general, they started with Perl, right? And CGI scripts and server-side includes and dynamic code running inside of an Apache server on a Linux box. And I'm old, and I remember building applications that way, and they were always fun, right? They were really fun to attack. And then when we start to think about security and we have to consider how the application is protected and how we test it and everything else, there's a wide gamut of what people call pen testing. Everything from simply running a Nessus scan against a web server, which, let's be very clear, I am not calling that pen testing, hence the quotes in the title, all the way up to taking something like Burp Suite or Zap and manually walking through every single application function and fuzzing the inputs and shoving payloads in there and determining what's going on. What I want people to do is to be closer to that side than the Nessus side, right? Because if you're just running Nessus against an application server, and I'm using Nessus as the example, there are lots of vulnerability scanners out there. Nessus just happens to be probably the most commonly known one and commonly used, to be blunt. You're not really doing a pen test. And for many developers and QA people and security consultants, they don't have the time to do a comprehensive test manually using Burp or Zap. Now, we can have the argument that if they don't have time, then they really shouldn't be doing it. I would agree with that. But we also need to make sure that we're building it out correctly. So the problem I see, and this is a saying I've heard for years, right? And that's, if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And I think that that's what we're seeing very often with pen tests. And at Secure Ideas, quite often we get copies of previous pen tests done, whether it's because of the expert witness work we do, or whether it's because of a consultant. When we go in as a consultant, the company provides the last pen test for us to review for some reason, or if it's because it's part of our SOSTA program, where we're providing advisory services to developers and QA people. And what we see a lot of times is that many pen testers, and not making fun of anybody here, I'm not calling anybody out here, but what we see is that many pen testers have a hammer and they bang on the website and they write up a report. And as you know, if you've ever tested a web application, you're gonna find vulnerabilities, right? In most applications, there are problems, low-hanging fruit that any zebra can find. I don't know why zebra is my example of a dumb animal, but let's go with it, right? They bang on the website and, oh, hey, you've got server information. I love that. Yeah, your server header is showing. Okay, did you exploit something because of that? No. Did you exploit anything else? No. We also see lots of false positives where they write up a report and a finding, and it's not really a finding. And again, I think that's because they have a hammer and they do the traditional, this is what I know how to do, and I'm going to poke here, I'm going to put a single quote here, I'm going to put a single quote over there. Oh, nope, not database. There's no SQL injection. Okay, did you try double quotes? Did you try active record? Did you try LDAP? Did you try other inputs? No, I didn't know what those. Well, okay, that's a problem. And I think that the reason we see so much of this is because that most people don't understand what they're attacking. And I want to be very clear, I'm including myself in that, because every single day I learn of something else I didn't know. And if you ever want to have a good time laughing at me, right, talk to Mick or Jason about website development and the problems I've run into, right? Talk about looking at an application and then taking what I'm doing and handing it to another consultant and saying, okay, this is where I've gotten to, this is what I've seen. And it's like, oh, but did you not know about this function, right? We'll talk about JWTs in a bit. And when I first started seeing JWTs, it was like, oh, that's odd, interesting, and what does that mean? And then I sat down with Jason, and Jason taught me what they meant, right? And that understanding helps us grasp what's important to test. That understanding is not just technology, right? The understanding also is, what about the application? What about the business? What about the organization behind it, where it's deployed, right? We see very often where something that is critical to fix in this industry is not in this industry over here, and vice versa, right? Something that isn't important to fix is absolutely important to fix elsewhere, right? So we have to understand how it's made. I love that show. It's such a dumb show, but I love the show, right? And we have to understand every bit of what it's made. And I don't think that you have to be a developer. Okay. This is a debate I see every once in a while on Twitter or Facebook or wherever we're arguing the latest rant. To be a good application pen tester, you have to be a developer. That's bogus. I find it to be gatekeeping. Does being a developer help? Maybe. I know great developers that are awesome pen testers. I also know horrible developers who are great pen testers. And I know other pen testers who have never developed a single line of code in their life. And what I've found is that when we talk about great pen testers, when we talk about great security assessments, the commonality is the knowledge and drive to understand how that system works before you test it, before you start throwing payloads, before you start trying to exploit it. Because and I've said this many, many times when I've been on stage or sitting in a chair like today, as a security industry, we really focus on the cool hacks, right? We focus on the exploitation. Oh my gosh, I stole 3 million credit card numbers. I dumped the database and got 1 million people's social security number with permission, right? That's what we focus on. But the reality is, when we look at a penetration test, when we look at the methodology that we follow, exploitation, which is the 4th step, which it's a cycle, so it's also the 8th step, the 12th step, the 16th step. We can do this math forever, right? But it's actually the smallest part of the test. It is the least amount of time that we spend in the window that we're testing. And let's just say it's a 5-day test, right? We don't spend 3 days exploiting stuff. We spend small periods of time exploiting. And all that exploitation is doing is validating that the finding is real and giving us a better understanding of what the vulnerability means to that organization, right? If I can get access to backend data stores, what's in there? What data is there? Is that data important? Can I dump authentication credentials? If I can, what can I do with them? Are they in plain text? Are they easily crackable? Are they stored well, right? That's what exploitation's for. And party stories, right? What we spend most of our time on is actually mapping. So reconnaissance, which I can't spell, looking out and seeing what's out there. Mapping is understanding how the app works. Then we move to discovery, which is where we're poking and prodding and determining what vulnerabilities exist in this application. And then, like I said, exploitation. So when we talk about this methodology, what are we looking for? Well, we have a good start with things like the OWASP Top 10, which, by the way, side note, the OWASP Top 10 was postponed from being released this year to being released next year. And one of the reasons it was postponed is because they don't have data. And I would like every tester out there, every consulting firm, every internal tester, to go out to the OWASP GitHub repo for the top 10 list, grab the sample files to submit data, and submit data for the last 3 years. The more data we get out there, the more valid this list is going to be next year when it's released. We've put up on the screen the 2013 version and the 2017 version, mainly because, and I'm not going to rant about it now because I've ranted about it lots of times, I think there were mistakes made because of a lack of data in 2017. I also think that many assessments that are regulatory or compliance related refer to the 2015 version still. So as pen testers, while we don't want to be compliance checkboxers, right, we do have to take into account what the organization we're testing has to be compliant with. So if that organization has to be compliant with something that is going to refer to the 2013 version, which by the way, I'm pointing at my monitor that has the slides on it, in case you're wondering why, because you keep pointing, because I'm an idiot and think you can see my monitor. You have to understand that that's the list they're going after. And not that that should change what you test, because the reality is nobody should be testing against the top 10. OWASP themselves even say that. It is not a test guidance. It is a report saying, hey, here are the most common vulnerabilities we found in the data set we have. That's it. We misuse it all the time, right? There are three big categories that you need to think about. Auth controls, and we abbreviate that because it's authentication and authorization, right? How do you handle it? How does it work? We want to look at input manipulation. We want to think about our input and how it's used by the application and how it comes back down to the client, whether that's the browser, a mobile app, an embedded app, a system, whatever, the Oculus. I just got an Oculus. I think it's fun. And then logic control. And with these three categories, I want to be very clear, this is not comprehensive. This is not everything you should be looking for, right? But this is a good start that if you're a developer, if you're a QA person, if you're a pen tester, which, let's be blunt, pen testers glorified QA, right? We just do something different when we find a bug. If you look for these three categories, if you start to evaluate things here, you're going to do better. And how do you do that? In my opinion, it's through mapping, right? And exploring and understanding and detecting problems while you build a map, hence the Sherlock Holmes references and the Discworld map. As you use the application, and please note, I didn't say abuse, I said use. As you use the application, you should be evaluating how it does things. How do the pieces fit together? How do the inputs get sent up to the server and come back and are used and consumed? Are they consumed on the server side? Are they consumed on the client side? Matter of fact, in modern applications, progressive web apps, single page apps, so much of the business logic is running inside the client. And so many of those tests I talked about that we see, that we look at, that we assess, don't do anything there. They don't evaluate anything. They don't evaluate anything in the local storage. They don't evaluate anything on the client side. Can you attack it? Can you change the business logic? Jumping back to those categories, right? So there's three things we want to think about while mapping that we're going to talk about today. Obviously, there's lots of things we can talk about while we're mapping, but today we're going to talk a little bit about authentication, authorization, APIs, and client-side features, okay? So let's start with authentication. Authentication and authorization, in my mind, is a fundamental part of every application. And I think in my mind, I'm correct. Of course, don't we all, right? If your application doesn't do this correctly, it really doesn't matter what other security controls you have in place. Really doesn't matter the cool WAF, the cool input validation, the awesome monitoring and logging that you're doing in the back. I know nobody calls monitoring and logging awesome, right? None of that matters because the foundation of security for your application failed because you messed up authentication or authorization or both, right? And we see lots of things here that people don't consider, right? And we talk about embedded. By embedded, I'm not talking IoT or embedded systems. What I mean here is the authentication and authorization is solely done within the application or the API, okay? They're not using single sign-on or something like that. The app maintains its own authentication authorization system. We also see a lot of problems with single sign-on systems, and whether that's a single sign-on system that you've purchased or one that you've built yourself. And let's be blunt, if you're building your own, you're probably going to screw it up, right? Is it because you're an idiot? No. It's because your focus is probably not on single sign-on systems, unless that's why you're building it, is because you want to become a single sign-on vendor. Your focus is on the application. The focus is on business purpose. The focus is on the business data. And this single sign-on system that you build, it's just a one-off, okay? The number of times we see people that will do single sign-on systems, and here's a good example of one. Single sign-on system, you come to the application, if you're not authenticated, it redirects you to the single sign-on system, right? The single sign-on system authenticates you, asks you for who you are, does all this cool stuff. And the test I'm thinking of, the single sign-on was really well implemented there on that server, on that part of the application, on that functionality. It authenticated the user. And then what did it do? It handed the application back, basically, no pun intended, basic authentication tokens that were then passed to the original application, right? So you did this really awesome, really cool single sign-on system, and then you handed it to the browser in the weakest form of authentication the world has ever seen. That might be an exaggeration, right? That's a problem. We also see multi-tenant systems and handling of tenancy across these applications. And then, of course, badly implemented multi-factor authentication. And again, in most cases, the badly implemented multi-factor is either roll your own, or there are bypasses for it. We have a customer that we test on a yearly basis, and they have a multi-factor authentication system, and they also have a hard-coded token that you can pass as one of the headers. And if that token exists, the multi-factor authentication just isn't checked, right? So you can put any number in the MFA field possible. And the reason they do it, and don't get me wrong, I get it. I understand why they do it. In their development environments, in their QA departments, they want to be able to load test. They want to do performance testing. And so what they did was they built this mechanism so that their load testing scripts and their development scripts didn't have to worry about multi-factor authentication. The problem is they promoted that feature, I hope you heard the italics and quotes, to production. So if you know that token, and let's be clear, I'm not going to say what it is, but it's not hard to guess, and you shove that into the production app, multi-factor is turned off, basically. You still have to put a number in the field, but that's it. These are the types of things we see, is that they roll out weaknesses. So let's talk about some of the issues. First, let's start with embedded. Remember, all the application authentication authorizations handled inside the application, solely in the application. The biggest thing as a pen tester that you should be doing is determining how the application maintains its state, right? One of the things, piss poor example, simple example, not modern at all. Look at the session tokens, right? Remove them, go to the app as you're mapping, log in, so authenticate to the system, you start using the system. Now, delete the session token that you were handed, right? Does the application log you out? Does the application continue to work? Does the application give you a new session token? So if it continues to work, then the session ID has nothing to do with authentication authorization, okay? Or nothing critical to do with authentication authorization. Look for something else. Is there a cookie being passed down? Is there client-side code. We see more and more applications using HTML5's local storage to put state data in there, okay? Another behavior we see, as a matter of fact, not this Friday, but the last Friday, Jason was testing an app, and he found that if you remove the session token and you made the request, the application handed you a new session token, but the application also accepted whatever information you said you were, okay? And so gave you a new session token and you could hijack another account, right? That wasn't the Friday app, that was a different app, but let's go with it. We see lots of applications that the developers have tried to solve the authentication authorization problem, and it's all with how they maintain state. So that's the first thing. Figure out how the application maintains state, okay? And if you can figure out how they maintain state, then you can start to abuse that. If it's something in local storage, okay, well then I'm gonna look around for a cross-site scripting flaw so that I can attack another user to pull their state, right? If they're using local storage, are they clearing local storage out? So are they killing the session correctly when it's done? Is something that you want to look at, right? Can you manipulate it? Can you change it? Okay. Multi-tenancy is another big one that we see more and more applications working this way, whether they are an application that your organization pays for, we'll get to cloud stuff in a second, right? Or whether it's an application you're providing and you have multi-tenancy within it, right? Multi-tenancy just means we have multiple tenants, or typically organizations, that use the application, and the application is presenting itself to them, their authentication authorization, as just within that tenant, okay? Dumb example, QuickBooks Online. I run a company, that might be a surprise if you missed the beginning, but I run a company and we use QuickBooks, right? We use it because our accountants asked us to, right? And so we use QuickBooks Online and we go in there and we have, I'm who set up the account, so I'm the primary user. And this is probably way more information than you need, and I'm probably giving out information I shouldn't, but oh well, don't care. I'm the primary user. So I manage the other users in the system. So I'm an administrator, but I'm not an administrator of QuickBooks Online. I'm an administrator of the Secure Ideas tenant in QuickBooks Online, right? And you may run a company, right? Tim Tomes, the keynote from today, he owns his own company. He may use QuickBooks as well. I have no idea. But if he does, he's probably the administrator of Tim Tomes's QuickBooks organization. And he manages those users. He can't manage my users. I can't manage his, even though from a description perspective, we have the same authorization rights. We have the same abilities inside the application. We just have them within our tenant, okay? So as pen testers, one of the things that we want to be able to do, obviously we would love to be able to escalate our privileges to maintain and administer QuickBooks Online, right? If we were attacking them. But I'd also like to be able to jump organizations. What happens if Tim can somehow figure out a way to manage the users in the Secure Ideas organization, right? So we want to look for things like that. We want to look for how the tenancy system maintains organizational state. How does it know who I am? How does it know what organization I'm part of? And sometimes that's simply the usernames have a preface. I can't even say words today. Sometimes it's another token. It's another part of what's passed down to the client and passed back up to the server, okay? And we have to look for that. Sometimes it's simple, it's called an org ID or something like that. Other times it's pretty complex, right? And we actually control what organization we're in based on the URL we hit or where we're coming from, okay? And we want to look for things like this. When we talk about cloud systems, I love cloud systems. I really do. When I first started and people said, oh man, the cloud, it's going to be awesome, I looked at it and said, this is stupid. And we've all seen the stickers, right? The cloud is just somebody else's computer. That was my attitude for a very long time. And I will tell you that if that is still your attitude as a tester, as a penetration tester, as a security consultant, then you aren't going to do as good a job as you should. Because the cloud is actually so much more. That is a valid statement. The cloud is just somebody else's computer. Absolutely. The LMS that SecurityIdeas runs on somebody else's computers. They manage the underlying system. They manage the servers and the hardware and the software that it's running on, right? But that's just the start. The ability to scale, the ability to spin stuff up, the functionality and other feature sets that are available to you to control and manage and administer your cloud systems is fascinating. It's also quite often misused in ways that we can attack. The simplest one, okay, we know it, right? Leaked credentials and tokens. How many times have you looked at a GitHub repo and seen where somebody committed their AWS tokens? I don't know about for you, but for me, it's a lot, right? People post comments. One of my favorite things to do is to go out and read the forums where organizations are asking for support in their cloud-based systems. And what I do is I limit it to my target. And what we find is that they ask questions, and as they're asking questions, they post credentials, they post access tokens, they give out the information. We find that during research and recon, right? But the other thing that we find is that if we look at the functionality of the cloud-based systems work, and remember that if I'm pen testing an app that's running in Azure, I'm allowed to pen test that app as long as I have permission, right? I'm not allowed to attack Microsoft's interfaces. I'm not allowed to attack the infrastructure running that app, right? Unless, of course, Microsoft was who hired me. But that doesn't mean we should ignore that infrastructure, that we should ignore how that system works and functions and does things, okay? As such, one of the things that you should do is to go out and look at things like, hey, how are S3 buckets managed, right? Because we all know the problem with S3 buckets being out there public and having data in them. But what about S3 buckets that are tied to applications? What about, we see this all the time. I will tell you that on a daily basis, some jackhole on the internet is vuln scanning securitideas.com. And they're trying to do, I giggle every time I see logs where somebody has tried to do SQL injection against securitideas.com. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not standing here saying, ha, 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 we're 100% secure. You can't do anything. No, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that the securitideas.com site is a static website. It's hosted in S3 bucket, fronted by CloudFront, right? It is static content. And so if you didn't realize that you could do that with an S3 bucket fronted by CloudFront, and you see the fact that there are parameters passed from page to page, and you think, oh, I can attack that. Okay, then you haven't understood, you don't have an understanding of the underlying infrastructure that is running. And we don't hide the fact that that's how we manage our system, right? Matter of fact, as far as I remember, we have a blog post where we talked about how we set it up. And so we release that information. We believe very firmly in sharing and being open. But if you don't understand the underlying system, if you didn't understand what an S3 bucket means, if you don't understand what that impacts your testing of our site, well, then you're going to spend a lot of time wasting time. And I don't know about you, but in the 10 years I've been running Secure Ideas, I've never had somebody give me an unlimited budget and unlimited time. I have to do things within the time frame I have. So research the systems. Look at things like, I'll tell you right now, we use SNS. So when you go to our website and you fill in a form, it is submitted to a Lambda. And that Lambda is dynamic, right? And that Lambda hands that message over to an SNS queue, and that comes to us, right? Is that attackable? Maybe, right? I'm not granting permission for everybody to go try, not against my site. But we've tried. We've locked down the things as well as we can, and we've tried to take into account these things. And when you test our site, if you were the company we hired to test it, we would hope that you would know how Lambdas work and know how the SNS system works, so that you would know what was okay to pass into it, right? And then go from there, right? All of this stuff becomes very important as you look at the systems. Right? APIs. APIs. I am old. I still remember the first API I built. It was a SOAP-based web service, and it was back-ended by a mainframe. A lot of XML. You still find SOAP-based APIs. I'm not going to get into SOAP-based APIs here, right? But what you have to see is that very much of your applications are back-ended by microservices or RESTful APIs. And yes, I know a RESTful API can be a microservice, and a microservice could be something other than a RESTful API. And what we need to do is, as we look at the application, we need to evaluate what is happening, again, during mapping. And the screenshots here, some of them might be, well, all of them might be difficult to read. I don't know how big they appear on your monitor. On my monitor, they're clear as anything. But if you can see them, what you'll see is all of these come from OWASP Juice Shop. I actually think that Juice Shop is a great example of a modern application that's vulnerable to lots of stuff that you can play with. And as you look at the application, what you should see is that there are calls to APIs. There's actually a number of APIs built into Juice Shop. There's an administration one, there's a front end one for users, there's one for products. All of this is available to you. Now, the nice thing about playing around with something like Juice Shop is that the solutions are known, right? Unlike when we do a pen test, we don't know what the vulnerabilities are that we're going to find. Here with Juice Shop, we do, so we can go and focus on them. And so what we say to people is, go out there and map what the APIs are. And I'll give you a good example with Juice Shop. What you'll see is that from the user interface, there are paths that you go to, routes that you can load. And then from the client-side code, it makes calls out to these APIs. Now, if all you're doing is looking at Burp, all you see are the requests, and you really don't understand where they're coming from. And if all you're doing is looking at the browser and not evaluating what's happening under the covers, all you see are the URLs that are presented to you. Now, if you're a real pen tester, you wouldn't do either of those two things. We still see it all the time. And so what you need to do is you need to map those. You need to understand what the different functions are. And for the developers in the room, even if you know what the API endpoints are, map them. And here's why. Very often, we find things that have been deployed that the developer doesn't realize is part of that API. Whether it's because they used a framework that added that, or whether it's because they inherited it from somebody else or another developer put it in and this developer didn't realize it. But very often when we finish an API test, and we do lots of them, we go back to the developers and we're like, hey, here's what we found. And they're like, oh, that's not part of our app. No, it is. It's right here, right? It's on your server. It's within your application. Your application actually calls it. Oh, I wonder where that came from. Don't know. Can't tell you that. I don't know where your code came from, but I do know I found this vulnerability and I did find this problem. So map them and then understand what the inputs are. So like, for example, one of the mistakes we see from people all the time is RESTful APIs use the HTTP methods to handle data back and forth. For example, you'll see a get to get data back. You'll see a post when they are submitting data to the API. You'll see a put when we're putting data in or information into the API. And you'll see a delete when you're removing records, right? And now think back to one of the first slides where I showed the Perl CGI scripts, right? If you were testing an app that was a Perl CGI and I told you that the server supported put and delete, you'd giggle, right? There'd be a little evil maniacal laughter. Way too often we see pen testers that will look at RESTful APIs, see that it uses a put and a delete, and flag that as a high risk. They don't even test it. They don't even verify that what they think is going on is what's going on. They just say, oh, that's bad. We see that a lot from internal security teams, right? Because of this traditional mindset. It's that method was bad. There's nothing about it. I don't need to verify it. It's bad to have. And the reality is that's not true. Could it be bad? Yes. If I can delete records out of your API without authorization, that would be bad. If I can put records into your API without authorization, that can be bad. But it's not the traditional bad, and we have to evaluate what's going on. So understand the inputs. What is the format? For example, you'll see JavaScript object notation, JSON, JSON, right? You'll see just normal, regular inputs, name value pairs. You'll also see, and this one throws off a lot of people, where instead of the URL being something like api.jsp (name equals Kevin and password ampersand password equals password, right? Instead of that type of format in the URL, instead you'll see URLs where the path and file name are actually parameters to the application, right? You'll see where those parameters, if you change them, if you change the one that's the name, it doesn't do anything, breaks the app. The API doesn't work right because you haven't passed in the correct name value pairs. If you change the value, you can actually start doing injections. You can put payloads there. You can actually start. So understand the format of what they're doing. Check to see if it's modifiable. In some systems, they actually sign the input to see if it's been manipulated before it's sent, right? So check that out. Find out how they're signing it. Look at the client-side code to see if you can sign it yourself. Or, as with like the JWTs, I'm just bouncing back because the screenshots are on here, right? Java Web Tokens can be signed. But when you specify the algorithm up at the top where it says ALG HS256, if you can read that, why don't you set it to none, right? So you don't encrypt it or unsign it, right? Does the application accept that? Does the application still use that token correctly, right? One of the examples here, and this is a spoiler, so if you don't want to hear a spoiler for Juice Shop, don't listen to this part, right? But you can actually hit the API, and what we find in many APIs is that they return significantly more data than the user needs. In this case, it's the lower left-hand screenshot. That's a response from the authentication-details function inside the user API for Juice Shop. And it actually dumps out a list of all the users in the system. And now that's more information than I need, but let's break it even worse. It actually sends you the authentication token for the current user, the users that are logged in, right? And it's in a JWT, so you can decode it. A JWT is just 3 pieces that are base 64 encoded. And we all know that base 64 is not encryption, right? So we pull that down, we decode it, and we now have the hash unsalted for the password for the user. And in JuShop, it's one user authenticated at a time because it's all local, but this is actually something we see quite often with other applications. It'll dump more information than you need, and you'll get things like tokens and credentials and hashes that you then have to crack, right? So how do you handle that? Now, how do you find all this stuff? Well, right off the bat, use the app, because what we find is if you have APIs, the APIs are called by the application, and look for things like mobile versions. Look for things like documentation that is available for the application. Many times, look to find out if the API is something built on a framework or something provided to them, especially if you're looking at like a single sign-on system that has been put on top of this. There's going to be APIs that came with the single sign-on system. Go read the documentation, see if there's things they can call. When we work with companies, one of the main things that we do is that we will ask for a Postman collection. So from your developers, Postman's a tool that will let you interact with RESTful APIs. If you get a Postman collection, you have the entire API that they've documented and tested themselves, right? And you can, for us, we run that through Burp, and we make the request through Burp, and then we have the Burp interface to do all the normal stuff that we do. If you can't get a Postman collection, Swagger collections, documentation, Swagger documentation can be converted to be able to be used, but at the very least, ask, right? Talk to them about what is available out there, okay? Finally, we want to talk about the client. And this is just a screenshot of the browser, right? Don't lose sight of the developer tools that are in your browser. The developer tools will let you know how the client is rendering things, what is available to the client, what the system uses to deal with stuff, right? It will also give you access, to things like local storage. You'll be able to look at the full response that's coming back down, all within the browser. So very useful if you're in one of those situations where, hey, test this, we'll give you a Citrix desktop that you have a browser in, and that's it. Okay. Is that good? Is that the right way to test? No, but it's a starting point. Okay. And the last thing I want to talk about is DOM-based XSS. Cross-site scripting. If you've ever heard me speak before, if you've ever talked to me, you know that probably my favorite vulnerability out there is cross-site scripting. I love attacking cross-site scripting. And we've forever known about reflected and persistent. You know, I send a payload up, it comes back down in the response, that's a reflected attack. If I send it up and it's stored somewhere on the application, that's a persistent attack. But DOM-based is very misunderstood. Okay, as a matter of fact, what I've found is that a lot of the documentation on DOM-based XSS is wrong. And some of the samples and examples of DOM-based XSS are wrong. DOM-based XSS is different from normal XSS, and I hate to call it that, but let's go with it for right now. Insofar as every piece of the attack is managed and handled and processed client-side. So if I make a request, I get a response, and in that response is client-side code that, in a simplistic example, references the URL and uses it on the page within the DOM, or the document object model. I have a good chance of a DOM-based XSS. And many of the libraries people will use, jQuery, Angular, whatever, they've had DOM-based XSS vulnerabilities that the library brings with it into your application. So even though your app wasn't vulnerable until you used the library, your use of the library added that vulnerability, okay? And so what you want to do is really look at what the client-side code is doing. And if the client-side code pulls data from the client, like I said, it could be the URL, could be things like local storage, it could be cookies, things that are within the client especially when you start talking about mobile apps, right? And then use those within the DOM. So you'll see things like .inner HTML, you'll see things like document.write. Please don't use document.write. And then what you have to do, you can't test these typically with the traditional XSS payloads. You can't just put script alert XSS close script tag, because since it's working in the DOM, you have to embed into where it's being used, okay? And so lots of times that code will be pulling that data, let's say from the URL, and then using it in a block of JavaScript. So you're gonna add JavaScript code to that block of JavaScript and it'll execute and things like that. Again, really take time to look at the client-side code and understand what's going on. And yes, that means you're going to be reading JavaScript. And for that, I apologize, because you're gonna have to read a lot of bad JavaScript. Okay, there are plugins that will help you with this. Both Zap and Burp will attempt to detect DOM-based XSS. My experience has been both of them have a high false positive rate. So you're really gonna have to look at what that client-side code looks like, okay? So that is my slides. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can start seeing Discord, I hope. And then I would say thank you very much. I think I went over slightly. Jason made a comment in Discord that JWTs can be encrypted, but we rarely encounter apps where they are. That is absolutely true. It's so sad that they can be, but most people don't out there. And I don't. So I'm looking really quick. I don't see any questions that I need to answer right this second. I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'm going to turn this over. Nice. If you need a new lanyard, let us know.
Thank you again for coming and sharing with it with everybody. I really appreciate it. Yeah, definitely keep an eye on there. If get a chance to hang out in Discord, there's plenty of folks in there. I'm sure there's that more than a few that would want to get to talk to.
Yep, I'll hang out for you.
Okay, awesome. All right, we'll see you sometime soon. All right, take care.